Good evening, everyone. My name is Paul Rozier. I am the director of the Albert Lepage Center for History in the Public Interest and a member of the Villanova History Department faculty. Welcome to the first Lepage Center webinar of the spring semester. It's not really spring, it's winter, but we are in the spring semester. A special welcome to our distinguished guests, Dr. Peter Raleigh, Dr. Jeremiah McCall, Dr. Pam Wojcik, and Dr. Makiba Levon, who will explore the topic of media and pop culture in historical perspective. Before we begin, I want to thank Assistant Director Kevin Fox and Communications Associate Christina Stella for helping to organize tonight's event. And I want to encourage you to attend the Lepage Center's next few events. This Thursday, the 29th, Professor Colleen Mitchell will offer our first Lunch at Lepage event. She will present research on the history of Augustinian sisters and their approach to Augustinian spirituality. That event will take place in the Lepage Center, SAC 410, from noon to 1 p.m. And on February 18th, please join us for our first crisis moments discussion of the semester, the border crisis in historical perspective. That event will take place in Driscoll Hall 132, Larson Auditorium from 6 to 7:15 p.m. Please check the Lepage Center website for information about other upcoming events. And now I'd like to introduce our moderator, Dr. Gina Talley, who will introduce our speakers in the order of their presentations. After their presentations, Dr. Talley will ask a few follow-up questions and then turn to your questions, which you can pose at any time in the Q&A function. Dr. Talley is an assistant teaching professor in the Department of History at Villanova, where she teaches courses in U.S. history and women's history. Her research interests include the social and cultural history of women, gender, and sexuality in the United States. She focuses on reproduction, definitions of femininity and masculinity, and childlessness in the progressive era. She is now working on a prosopographic project that examines the lives of architect Julia Morgan, artist Ida O'Keeffe, gallerist and photographer Alfred Stieglitz, patron of the arts Mabel Lodge Lujan, and photographer Edward Westing. Welcome, Dr. Talley.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you so much. So I'll just read the bios for our four panelists, and then each will present for about 5 to 7 minutes, and then we'll go to questions. So first we have Pamela Robertson Wojcik, who is the Andrew V. Takis Professor and Chair of the Department of Film and Television and Theater at the University of Notre Dame. She is the former president of the Society for Cinema and Media Studies and a Guggenheim recipient. Her research focuses on American cinema with particular interest in examining the ways in which film negotiates and interrogates issues of modernity, gender, and cultural change, especially in relation to urban space. Her most recent publications are the co-edited Routledge Companion to the American Film History and her monograph Unhomed, Cycles of Mobility and Placelessness in American Cinema. Makiba Levon received her PhD from the Department of English at the Graduate Center, CUNY. Currently, she is an assistant professor of English at Grinnell College. Her research focuses on African American studies, Afrofuturism, speculative fiction, and popular cultural media studies. She has been published in Women's Studies Quarterly, Radical Teacher, Africology, the Journal of Pan-African Studies, and Modern Language Studies. As a part of Lost and Found, the CUNY Poetics Document Initiative, she co-edited Realizing the Dream of a Black University and Other Writings, a collaborative publication of Tony Cade Bambara's teaching materials from CUNY and Spelman College. Peter Raleigh, next, is a writer and critic based in Chicago, where he teaches classes on the pre-modern history of Europe and the Mediterranean at multiple universities. He was awarded a PhD in history at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill in 2019. And his academic research and teaching focuses in particular on the central medieval history of England and the history of the Roman Republic. His Substack, which I have checked out, Long Library, is home to his writing about film, which is especially concerned with the ways films interact with and are inflected by particular historical moments or comment on historical circumstances. He is particularly interested in horror cinema, with its capacity to reflect contemporary anxieties and comment on political economic conditions. And then finally, Jeremiah McCall is a historian, historical games studies scholar, teacher, and leading expert on the use of historical games in history education and games as a historical form. He has taught high school history for 25 years, the last 24 at Cincinnati Country Day School. In addition to designing instructional approaches to guide students to think like experts, he is also a researcher and designer of learning environments that incorporate simulation games for critical inquiry into history. Gaming the Past, Using Video Games to Teach Secondary History, is his first book on the subject. The second, Designing Historical Games for Classrooms, a Practical Guide for Educators, will be published this year, among other articles and books about historical games and their impact on history education. In addition, Dr. McCall has written 5 Roman history books, including 2015's Swords and Cinema, Hollywood versus the Reality of Ancient Battle, and most recently, 2022's Rivalries That Destroyed the Roman Republic. All right, so we will go in that order. So Pamela, you're welcome to begin.
All right, thanks, Gina, for the introduction, and thank you all for having me. My approach to this topic is not to consider representations of history or historical fictions, though I'm more than happy to discuss them after. Rather, I want to approach the question, I forgot to share. Okay, there we go. I want to approach the question of whether and how media, and especially cinema, can be influenced by and expressive of their socio-political historical context, or what we can learn about history by looking at cinema. In a now infamous blog post, film scholar David Bordwell decried the critical practice of what he called reflectionism, the suggestion that movies can bear traces of the national psyche or reflect national debates we're having right now, or provide inadvertent allegories of contemporary history. He was particularly mad because somebody was reading into Dawn of the Planet of the Apes something about its relevance for contemporary life. Bordwell allows that some films may be made by specific filmmakers with specific political intent, but he claims that no films spontaneously and unselfconsciously tap into the zeitgeist. In part, he argues that films cannot reflect a dominant political mood because movies take years to make, and thus would have to be seen as predictive rather than reflective. In addition, he argues that reflectionism ignores the range of incompatible material on offer. How, he asks, would reflectionism explain the simultaneous emergence and appeal of 1940s film noir and sunny musicals in the United States in the same years? I would suggest that while there certainly may be similarities in mood across diverse genres, and there very often are, there may also be competing ideologies, tensions, and moods at any given moment in time to which different genres and films appeal, a point Bordwell himself raises as an absurdity. He writes, or we could float the rather uncompelling claim that several hundred films reflect hundreds of different and contradictory facets of the audience's inner life. Why Bordwell considers this possibility uncompelling is unclear, as multiplicity and contradiction exist in any historical moment. Think of the bifurcated ideologies and moods we're currently witnessing in the United States, even those that seem from a historical distance to have consensus. So while one film or set of films may tap into post-war relief and optimism for the future, another film or set of films might reflect some lingering wartime anxiety or uncertainty about that same future. In his dismissal of reflectionism, Bordwell writes, talk about an American film of the 1950s, and sooner or later someone will invoke the reign of blandness that was purportedly the Eisenhower administration. Bordwell is correct to be suspicious of easy claims that films of the 50s reflect the ethos of the Eisenhower administration. However, the problem is not in the idea that the films might reflect something about the political moment. It's rather located in that purportedly, which signals an overly simplistic reading of what the Eisenhower years might comprise or mean. For me, the problem with reflectionism is not in claims that films can tell us something about a historical period. The problem is that we too often project ahistorical or overly simplistic understandings of a historical period back onto films. To be sure, if we look to the films of the 50s, asking them to signify Eisenhower or show the dominant model of suburban conformity, we may find what we seek. But if we look at the films to see what they can uncover about a historical moment, we'll find a much more complex and contradictory picture of the past that may illuminate aspects of history that have been forgotten or lost. As Frederick Jameson articulated decades ago in The Political Unconscious, when we consider the relationship between a text and its historical context, we're not assuming a simple reflection or mirroring of its most obvious world historical facts, but instead grappling with contradictions, multiplicities, and subtexts. Jameson argues that a narrative may itself be seen as the rewriting or restructuration of a prior historical or ideological subtext, it being always understood that that subtext is not immediately present as such, not some common sense external reality, nor even the conventional narratives of history manuals, but rather must itself always be reconstructed after the fact. The act of considering how films mean in relation to context is what Lauren Berlant describes as a creative archival practice, a process of making context for texts rather than projecting pre-existing contexts onto texts. To explain my own creative archival practice, I use the phrase acts of recovery, deliberately echoing the language of recovered memories to describe the work that can be done to discover social and cultural histories via cinema. Much of my work involves excavating something that was once very obvious and taken for granted in its cultural moment, but has somehow been forgotten or turned into a wrong-headed commonplace. In The Apartment Plot, I examine the frequency of narratives organized around apartment living as representing an important alternative to dominant discourses about mid-century America, including the purported blandness of the Eisenhower years and concomitant assumptions about the emphasis on marriage, suburban living, and containment. The mid-century apartment is not only key to the imaginary of the lives of queer and single people, African Americans, working class whites, and ethnic minorities, but also offers alternate visions of middle-class, white, married urban life and child rearing, all of which are negated by the emphasis on the suburban imaginary as evidence of the conformity of the Eisenhower years. My recent book, Unhomed, examines America's ambivalent and shifting attitudes toward placelessness through marginalized figures of mobility. Unhomed examines films that show characters as unhomed and placeless, mobile rather than fixed, failing, resisting, or opting out of the mandate for a home of one's own. These narratives suggest the degree to which ideas of home and fixity in America depend upon the othering of certain modes of mobility while promulgating others. They show a tension in the American imaginary between viewing homelessness as on the one hand deviance or threat, and on the other as freedom and independence. And in the chapters, I talk about the tramp and the figure of the tramp and sort of use that films about the tramp to uncover the long history of tramp scares from post-Civil War to about World War I. Actually, about World War II. And then I talk about World War II veterans returning home and that kind of homelessness. I talk about female hitchhikers. I talk about the conventional, what we imagine as the homeless in the 80s and sort of various policies that led to an increase in homelessness at the time and ideas about homelessness. And I talk about the contemporary precariat. So each one of these gets mapped through looking at films and particularly film cycles. Considering film cycles, and especially considering films not usually discussed as great works of art or even as historically significant, so that the roster of films is quite expansive and in some cases quite trashy, helps to capture what often gets lost from our understanding of history as time slips away. So I would suggest that we can think of films as in some way reflecting history, but that we need to work from and through the texts and be open to seeing history as it manifests in cinema and avoid projecting some preconceived notion of history onto the films. Thank you. Stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We'll go to Makiva next.
Alrighty, so I'm taking a bit of a different tack because when I thought about this panel, I guess I'm just so deep into planning for the semester that I immediately thought of my teaching materials. So I'm just going to break down the way I discuss media and history across my classes I've recently taught or am currently teaching. And so for um, currently teaching, one of the things that I ask my students is, how do we decide which stories we tell, right? Who decides the stories we tell? Who decides the stories that are important to publish, the stories that are important to adapt, right, into film and television? And one of the things I always assign is Zora Neale Hurston's um, what white publishers won't print, because she essentially lays out that very premise, right? The fact that they're part of what happens with media is what Patricia Hill Collins calls controlling images, right? Like we have ideas about what um, populations look like, sound like, are like, and we get a lot of those ideas from the media. And so one of the things that we explore is this question of why. Why do so many movies and TV shows that feature Black people center pain, whether it's historical or otherwise? And so at the 100 level, I'm currently teaching a class called Introduction to Literary Analysis. And the focus on the class is vampires. And so it's interesting because vampires are a popular culture phenomenon, right? But when you start to peel back the layers of um, the stories we tell about vampirism and where vampirism comes from culturally and globally, it's often mired in disease, in bigotry, right? All of the negative stories that we tell about certain populations. And one of the fascinating things about this class is that we start with in part, The Black Vampire, which is a story that I had not heard of before I started researching for this class. And it is a story of an enslaved vampire in what was then Santo Domingo who uses his vampirism to lead a slave revolt. And so students are always very surprised by this because the idea that we have about vampirism in our national imagination is not that, right? And so I think part of what is powerful about a popular culture phenomenon like vampirism is that it can help shift paradigms, not just in terms of what we see in the media, but also what people think about in terms of real life populations. And so throughout the course of the semester, we also have other vampires that are, people of color or, come from other cultures. And I think it really opens up the conversation about what the monster means, but also what our society gleans from these depictions of the monster. So on the 200 level, I recently taught a class called Adaptation. And one of the things we discussed, going back to the Hurston, is who gets to receive an adaptation, right? And so one of the things students noticed is that most adaptations in the US are not by people of color. They're not for or by people of color. And so, even while putting together the syllabus, I had a hard time finding um, films that were adaptations across time that weren't dour, right? Just very heavy, depressing even. And so what does it mean to have that be the steady progression and depiction of Black people in the US across time, right? So that's one of the central aspects of that particular class. Um, and it's also fascinating to see how the source material is adapted and what kind of negotiations are necessary to get your particular story told. So if we think about Percival Everett's Erasure, what we get in American fiction is quite different, particularly in regard to the ending. And some of the relationships. And so for me, that is the part that's always very interesting. It's like, okay, even if you do manage to get your adaptation made, what do you have to leave out? What do you have to add in? What does the casting look like, in regards to colorism or anything else? Um, and so that those were very it was a very popular class, and it was a very generative one, I would say, in terms of the way we were discussing popular culture at this moment and what we were seeing in terms of adaptations that were being made. So, also at the 200 level, I teach a class called Traditions in African American Literature. It's the African American Literature Survey. And this one, we usually start in some ways with Birth of a Nation because it helps set the tone for many of the things that the Black writers that we are discussing are writing against. Also, the laws that come out of the laws and the rise of the KKK again, that come out of the popularity of Birth of a Nation, particularly because it was legitimized as being the first movie that was shown at the White House, right? And so across time, we start there, 1915. We also talk about Oscar Micheaux, which almost no students hear about, which is very sad, but also not surprising. And we usually sort of end with passing because it's such a fascinating tale of life imitating, of fiction imitating life, both for um, the writer, but also for the director, Rebecca Hall's story. And so we get into what whiteness means, what blackness means, what does it mean to pass? How does media sort of stoke these ideas of racial difference and help cement them into our own psyches? How do we fight against that? How do we recognize propaganda, even? Right? What does it mean to have propaganda on such a large scale? What does it mean to have propaganda that is harmful and, popularized by the federal government? What does that mean then, and what does it mean now? And so finally, the African American Literature Seminar is often really fun because it's speculative. And so we get to talk about things like Sinners and Get Out, right? Things that are that offer us a pathway that isn't just uh nihilism or negative, and that all the Black people die in the end. And so all of this sort of feeds into my research. I'm currently writing a book about the depiction of interracial relationships across um, media and how that kind of works as propaganda to minimize the damage that's being done by the rise of fascism. Like, we can't be in such a terrible place if every time you turn on the television, all of the couples are mixed race, right? Like, why is that a thing? And so I'm really fascinated by that, and how that connects to the history that we first see in something like The Klansman and Birth of a Nation. Thank you.
Fantastic. I would love to take all of those classes. They sound wonderful. We'll move to Peter next.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, folks, for coming, and thank you to the Lepage Center for having me. I'm going to share my screen with what could be described as an embarrassingly rudimentary PowerPoint, mostly just by virtue of sort of showing my notes. Everybody got that? Good.
Yes.
Okay. So I kind of, when discussing the sort of question of film and history and their interrelationship, I find on this subject that I sort of wear two hats. On the one hand, I teach pre-modern history. I teach ancient and medieval history. And so I'm looking to communicate something to students about the pre-modern past. And I'm sometimes dealing with preconceptions about the past rooted in popular culture, attitudes about history that are derived from movies and from TV and from mass media in various ways. Uh, in some ways, the nature of teaching the pre-modern, specifically of teaching ancient and medieval history, is that in a lot of cases, those are all the preconceptions that the students have. There's very frequently little prior formal instruction on those subjects in their past. So, they come in with attitudes that are very much informed by popular culture, if anything. On the other hand, the sort of second hat is, I write about film and I participate in, critical and online conversations about film where the attitude towards pop culture representation of the past and towards film adaptations of historical subjects is very different from, what you might find in scholarly circles, intellectual circles. And so, swimming in the middle of those two currents is, I think, sometimes very interesting. And what it seems to me is the core kind of question for instructors in dealing with pop cultural depictions of the past, of those periods of the past that we're looking to teach as subject matter areas in their own right. The question, I think, is basically how do we deal with the fact that students derive so much of their historical imaginary from works of popular culture and mass media that reflect the present, that are driven by not only historical concerns of the present, not only present day attitudes, political discussions, but also, commercial considerations and conditions of production, right, that are distinctively modern, right? So we have this artwork that's being produced in a distinctively modern context to meet modern needs, to reflect modern arguments and attitudes. And from these artworks, students and members of the public are in many cases shaping ideas that they have about the historical past as a subject area, right? And how we address that seems to me, one of the core questions for historical instruction and for talking about history with students. And I think of some questions, beneath that, coming at this from, again, the sort of film enthusiast, film writer, cinephile side of things. The attitude generally in those circles is that filmmakers have very little responsibility to their historical material, right? A very strong emphasis, I think, in cinephile circles is placed on the freedom of artistic expression and the ability of artists to create art inspired by historical themes without feeling sort of pedantically bound to it. But I think everybody acknowledges some exceptions to that total lack of responsibility. I'd say, for instance, most people would agree that a film like Killers of the Flower Moon has some responsibility to its subject matter, has some responsibility to the stories that it's telling. Maybe somewhat fewer people think that a movie like Ridley Scott's Napoleon has that same responsibility. What where does that line get drawn? What kinds of principles shape different responses to those movies? That's something I'm interested in. I also think it's interesting to ask, to the extent that films do present the past in ways that are shaped by modern concerns and modern material conditions, is that really any different from the sources that my students read in their pre-modern history classes? When I assign my students excerpts from historians of the Roman Republic writing about their past, which they're to read as, primary sources for the ancient past, I'm very clear with them. They are reading, you know, later writers reflecting on their history in ways that are shaped by their own contemporary concerns and political conditions and things of that kind. So really, students are not in theory being asked to do anything different if they consider the depiction of history or the past in a film or TV show. It's just a question of whether we are sort of making it clear as a culture that this is a useful exercise, whether that kind of reflection on the conditions that shape film is being encouraged at a kind of cultural level. Then, there's the question of kind of new technologies, new media. I mean, a lot of my students are not encountering movies or TV shows the way I did, right? The way I did when I was their age, the way I do now, and are questions of reception and of historical perception being shaped by that. To kind of concretize what I'm talking about, I want to give an example, just very briefly, of two movies that I think can illustrate some of these questions. And they're both movies that I have students ask me about not infrequently when we cover sort of similar subject. Movies that students have heard of and that they approach me to say, "What do you think of this movie?" Which I think they always expect to get sort of a list of a list of objections to the costuming, and that tends not to be my approach to these things. But so on the one hand, these are movies from a similar time period. These both emerge broadly from the years following the U.S. invasion of Iraq, and they both were read fairly clearly in their moment of release as reflecting to some degree a certain kind of argument or rhetoric about that invasion, right? On the one hand, Ridley Scott's Kingdom of Heaven, which is a film that depicts the period around the Third Crusade, the late 12th century in the Kingdom of Jerusalem, and which positions this conflict very much as a question of sort of religious puritanism and cosmopolitanism being being trodden upon by zealous evangelical kind of religious extremism, right? You have in this film a fairly cosmopolitan and pluralistic Muslim society being confronted with an invading force that is predominantly, zealously and exclusivistically Christian in a way that their opponents in the film are not. And that was making a certain argument about the Iraq War, I think, fairly transparently at its time of release, and I think the filmmakers were relatively open about that. At the same time, I have as our sort of contrasting example the film 300 from just a couple of years later, Zack Snyder's film working from a Frank Miller graphic novel, which is about the Battle of Thermopylae in the Greco-Persian Wars and tells the story, the sort of pseudo-historical narrative of the 300 Spartans in their fight against the invading army of the Achaemenid Empire. This very much a movie, I think, rooted in or expressing a certain conversation about the sort of heroic defense of Western civilization against a Middle Eastern other. That's very much the sort of text of the film. It's fairly explicit. And I think at the time of release, it took part in those kinds of conversations. It was seen as reflecting a kind of discourse around the heroic Westerner versus the kind of orientalized other, the effeminized other, things of this kind, right? So both of these movies, and this, could I think very much speak to the conversation around David Bordwell's piece raised by Pamela earlier. These movies do not reflect social attitudes around the Iraq War in a homogenous way. They take two very different positions on that conflict. But not only that, it's not necessarily clear that students coming to them now can read them simply in the way that I just laid out, right? Because, first of all, students encountering these movies now, as they continue to do, as they do continue to encounter them, no longer necessarily have the context of a massive ongoing national discourse about the Iraq War, right? They may be aware that that conversation was happening when these movies were released, or they may not. They're now encountering them in a new context that changes their reception of them accordingly. Not only this, I know for an absolute fact that they encounter movies like 300 very frequently in edits, in brief TikTok clips, in Instagram screenshots, captioned in certain ways to reflect certain kinds of political programs. And so the question then becomes, what can we say about this movie's treatment of its historical subject matter in a world where its reception will change so drastically across generations, in a world where its reception will be transformed by the medium of distribution and by the, age and cultural background of the person encountering it. It's by no means clear, I think, that either one of these filmmakers could have made these films in a way that would have made a single static argument about the past capable of being transmitted across time and remaining static across all media. And that I think is really the heart of the matter, right? That the study of these treatments of the past and our attempt to take something about the historical past from them has to be rooted in the understanding that they that no single argument about history is ever made by a work of art, and no single argument about the past can ever be expected to be received by the audience in a sort of uniform and homogenous way. In short, I'm always having to meet students where they are in terms of their approach to the past, and I'm always having to adjust my commentary on historical fiction and on artworks about the historical past to reflect what I'm learning about where they find these things and what they make of them. It's a moving target, and I think to some degree it always will be.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's such an interesting question about how students are encountering not entirely the whole work necessarily at this point. All right, we'll move on to Jeremiah, our last speaker.
Thank you. Hi, folks. Let me just get my PowerPoint up. So, wow, what great ideas. It's sort of an interesting indication of where video games and historical games are in general, that we have three people who are all highly qualified to talk about film as history, and only one person talking about video games as history. And that's because historical game studies is still a very new field. We borrow a lot of ideas from historical film studies, but are sort of kind of paving our own way about, what this medium is. So I was definitely overwhelmed by the thought of what are people getting from these games. That's, to me, that's a media effects question, and we just don't know. We just don't know what people are getting from video games. We're pretty comfortable that they're not getting violent from it. That got shelved a while ago. But what exactly? So I, like my colleagues, kind of just wanted to contextualize a little bit where I'm coming from in the study of games and history, and maybe point to some things that games about the past do, and then kind of leave the question open about, how much people perceive those or not. I'm coming from an ancient historian perspective. I'm a Roman historian by training. And so close reading is really important to me, and that's really important when I'm looking at a video game about the past or a text. I am a humanist. I think that citing sources and humans connecting with humans is what we're fundamentally doing in these fields. We can have a talk about why AI is very problematic based on that at some point, but not right now. But as an ancient historian, and Peter said this too, we work with what we have. And most often what we have is not very much. And so, and again, Peter said it, If you're used to reading Plutarch about the ancient Roman world, written 800 years after the events he describes, it's not such a big deal to take a video game and use it as a secondary source. And I think that's how I first started approaching it. My first talk on video games and history was 20 years ago this past spring, 25. And I suggested you use video games kind of as secondary sources and critique them along the way. And that's always been really important. But I kind of graduated from there, and I'll get to that in a second. I definitely have an educator perspective. I've been teaching a quarter century in high schools. It is my passion. It is my calling. I hope I'm good at it. And so that's led to some ways that I look at video games as well. I'm practically objectivist. I'm well aware that the past is gone, and I'm well aware of postmodernism. And I'm well aware that, we can't have a definitive interpretation of things. But I generally defy people who teach in a class to say, okay, there are no facts, there's nothing objective, there's nothing that I actually need you to learn. Most of us, when we're teaching in a classroom, don't go that way. We suggest there are some things that are kind of anchor posts. So I'm a practical objectivist, kind of like Sisyphus. There is no objective past we can actually reach, but we actually have to try and get there, even though we can't reach it. And having students know what they know and knowing how they know what they know is the most critical thing to me. I am much more interested in students being able to track their information and source it and cite it than I am their sense of um, what they know out of that context. So all of this kind of comes together. For me, game experiences are mediated. I am fascinated by the question of what people receive from games when they're not mediated by an educator. And again, the question is, we don't know. There's been a little bit of research on this. Lisa Gilbert did a fantastic article on this a few years ago, looking at high school students, where they thought Assassin's Creed's version of the American Revolution was more realistic than the teachers because it sort of spoke to you in a conspiracy theorist sort of real talk way. I would argue that's as much as a filmic representation as is a video game representation. So we know that players so very frequently do not pay attention to whatever the messages were that the designers wanted to communicate. You may all remember Monopoly, right? Was the landlord game. And I can't remember her name who designed it, but she designed it in the 30s. And it was meant to be the landlord game where you were supposed to feel really bad about exploiting people and taking all their money and things like that. And nobody really liked that part. They liked the gaining money and the capitalism, so they made it into Monopoly. Games on mutually assured destruction that are supposed to scare people, have people laughing and enjoying blowing each other up. So it's really hard to know from that. So for me, the mediated experience is really important as an educator, kind of talking through what does the evidence sustain and what does it not sustain when we're looking at games about the past. And then I guess the other thing I would say is all history is educative. Whether it's a game, whether it's a teacher, whether it's a book, right? If you're saying the past is this way more than that way, you're trying to induce or educe some different feelings and opinions from people. That is education, right? That is leaving things out. And then finally, and I came to this over time pretty honestly, because I was passionate about using games in the classroom, is that there are just so many ways one can do history. And I think my colleagues all agree with this, but I'm not sure anybody's said it yet, right? Film is history. Video games are history, right? I interpret history pretty broadly as a selective interpretation of the past. I used to define it as something experts did and had the passion to like make my kids understand all the cool PhD stuff I did, but that was 25 years ago. And then to integrate things like games into my teaching experience, I really had to make that crossover that anything that's a selective interpretation of the past is going to be history. Conversations with your grandmother, films that you watch, whatever. I mean, these are all history. So that kind of all comes together for me. And then what that leads me to is this idea that we really can't draw a bright line between game histories and other kinds of histories. So I threw a bunch of examples on here, and it's not entirely clear to me that any of these is any more or less selective than the others, and it's an interpretation of the past. So you've got your Assassin's Creeds and your Civilizations, but you've also got film series. I did this slide originally for a Roman history panel. It's a lot of Roman based, right? But we've got David's Oath of the Herati, and we've got Rome, and we've got all sorts of things going on in here. And what I would say is, I've found over the years, and that's kind of where most of my research and work is that I have this doodle over on the side. You take the raw source material of history, which is always going to be selective, right? We don't have it all. And if we had it all, we can't select it all. And we throw it into the hopper, that is the selective interpretation of the past. And then we shape it by a medium. Dramatic film has its conventions, and documentary has its conventions, and speeches have their conventions, and classrooms and games, in fact. And what you get out, right, is these histories that are in a variety of media. They're all abstractions. They're all trying to limit the totality of the past into something that's sort of manageable and understandable. So a lot of that has nothing to do with games necessarily, but so let's link that to games. What I would suggest is that games, when you're functioning on game mechanics, video game mechanics, or the rules of the actual games, they present games as historical problem spaces. And I would say that every single game in existence that I have ever seen that is about the past has portrayed it in terms of a historical problem space. I think that gets into the definition of what a game is for many people. What I mean by that is they take the past, designers and developers, and they take that historical content, if you will, and they create it with a focused on agent. There's some kind of player agent that is going to be the focus of everything. That agent has goals that they're trying to achieve, and those goals are very clearly set out in most any video game. This is what you're trying to achieve. The player agent has action choices, I call them. The idea being you choose and then you act. There are things that you can do and things that you cannot do to reach those goals. And all of it is contextualized, right? History does not take place in like sort of talking heads, right? It takes place in real worlds and real spaces. So all video games about the past contextualize that player agent and game goals and choices within a game world. And there's stuff in it. Sometimes it's other humans. I call them agents because I think it's really important to remember that all sentient beings should have agency and should have the ability to have agency, because games don't actually represent that a lot of time. Resources, tools, and obstacles. And whether you're playing Civilization or you're playing Assassin's Creed or you're playing Call of Duty, these all kind of fit that. So that's kind of the basic argument I'd make is you've got an agential history. You're an agent trying to solve goals in a space. Do players then perceive that they are more active, that they're more problem solving? Probably. I think there's a lot of people who find that games offer that kind of in a way that's different from film or literature or things, the ability to make your own choices to actually change the story, the diegetic version of it. What's the effect? Marginalization, right? You're picking your player agent, and your player agent, right? Absolutely in games has tended more often than not to be white and male and cis and heterosexual and a whole list of hegemonic things. And people in the game that are not the player agent tend to be represented as tools. That's the instrumentalization. You found this a lot with colonial games. I mean, it was as recently as 2008 when Firaxis thought that Sid Meier's Colonization deserved a remake, which had all sorts of problematic portrayals of indigenous people, ignored West African enslavement, ignored disease, and all sorts of things. And so you find all these groups who are not the colonizers and the conquerors sort of treated as instruments. Do you help me or hurt me? Help me or hurt me is how things work in games, but that would be a horrific way to kind of walk away from that. An overemphasis on power and agency. If my friend Vinicius is still in the audience, I did a little scan there. He has been pushing me so well to think about these things. The idea of agency is very loaded, right? What do we mean by having meaningful choices, and who gets to decide what's meaningful and things like that? In a game, you know what your goals are, right? That you're trying to reach. And you can choose not to do that. But if you're playing the game, you're making choices to reach those goals. And so there's an overemphasis probably on agency, on knowing what you want to do and what you're trying to do. But maybe there's some empowered problem solving in there as well. Maybe there's a sense that, I can make a difference. I can make some choices that fix things, and address things. And so much of it depends on designers and designs. The completely undiverse group of video game developers from 20 years ago there has been including and expanding, and we have, particularly in independent game development movements and things like that, we have so many different people doing so many different kinds of games. So there's lots of terrific stuff out there. So all of these things really would depend on designers and design. But that's what I will leave it at. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. Thank you all so much for your comments. I'm going to start with a few questions before going to the audience questions. So how do you find that movies, television, fiction, or video games affect the way that people understand history? And maybe you can think about either, the public or perhaps the students that you teach, and anyone's welcome to jump into the question. So how do they affect the way that people understand history? What have you most noticed?
Gina? I think it varies quite a lot. Um, some introduce narratives and people that spectators and consumers know nothing about. They might open a door, others reframe knowledge or challenge what people think they know. Some give a false sense. And I think different viewers bring different knowledge to things. So that one text might be illuminating for me, presenting new information, things I didn't know. Another might confirm or challenge what someone else knows, and I think of something like the TV series Death by Lightning, right, which just ran recently, that shows the rise and assassination of President James Garfield, shows his VP, Chester Arthur, stepping up, taking his place. This history, I think, is not as well known as some. Garfield seems like one of these forgotten presidents. And the choice to show him now is fascinating, right? And I think it's one of those, where Peter talked about sort of, it's more about now than then at a certain level, meant to reflect a president. Perhaps, he's pro civil rights, he's progressive, he's anti corruption. So he's kind of a president we wish we had versus the one we have now for many of us. And it's also showing the stupidity and mistaken conspiracy theories behind certain modes of political violence. So I think for many people, it might open up an area of interest where people might want to learn more. My brother, who's, knows a lot of history, immediate was like, I got to read a biography of Chester Arthur. Like, I got to know more Chester Arthur. But I think there's also the question of who's going to watch it. What's going to draw them to it if they don't already have some idea. And that's where things like Stardom matter, because it's Michael Shannon and it's Nick Offerman. And so, what lures them into history is also, I think, an important question.
Yeah, others?
Yeah, I was just going to remark, I think that again, as the teacher in the classroom, it's you develop a very kind of ambivalent or conflicted attitude towards pop cultural representations of the past in some cases, because there are situations where when a certain kind of artwork or film or whatever becomes sort of ubiquitous, that there are going to be some new road bumps, some new sort of bumps in the road for you in the classroom that weren't there before, right? Some new sort of images that you'll be grappling with that maybe you weren't in the past, and perhaps vainly you sort of hoped your students would be a clean slate for your instruction, and they never actually are, right? It's a silly hope, it's a vain hope. But on the other hand, I would certainly say, there's no question that pop cultural depictions of the past develop student interest in classes. And so really for instructors of the pre-modern especially, we have to be sort of grateful for it. I mean, there's almost no alternative. I mean, there's more in Jeremiah's wheelhouse, but I get a lot of mileage out of those Assassin's Creed games. You know what I mean? It's yes, there are some drawbacks, but some students are coming into my classroom with an excitement about areas of the past that they were not going to be interested in before, before engaging with one of these works. So it's something I think I have to be, by rights, sort of appreciative of whether I want to or not, because at this point, let me tell you, the pre-modern history classroom, any way you get them in, is a good way to get them in.
Yeah, I found that that's so much the starting point when I, sort of ask students what into what gets them into history. It can be those things and films, absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else want to jump in?
I guess I'll tag off that. I mean, absolutely. I mean, whatever gets the kids in is great. Although I'm dealing with a younger crowd, so I don't necessarily always have a lot of experience with the types of games, that we talk about here representing history, right? We have far more, mobile gamers and things like that going on. So yeah, that's really a big thing. What you both mentioned, this sort of getting people excited and wanting to know more. I would say, this is not my particular area, right? But if you're actually looking at the historical games that bring in the big bucks, right, then we've very much got a neoliberal world order with white males doing most of the shooting and killing of everybody else that, defends it, right? Your Calls of Duty and your battlefields, and things like that. And so that's certainly um, um, I mean, it's a real issue. It's a real problem, right? I don't know that it's more of a problem necessarily, than film portrayals that way. And just like films, again, if you start looking at the richness and the diversity, I mean, one of my favorite go-to games to mention is When Rivers Were Trails, which was an indigenous game design response to Oregon Trail. It's freely available, where you are an Anishinaabe young person, displaced from your Minnesota homeland and have to trek to the west to go to a reservation in California. And so the idea sort of turns things on its head and lets you think sort of about the impacts of American colonialism. So it's not a monolithic thing, but definitely right. There's a lot of shooting and a lot of capitalism and a lot of empire.
Any other comments perhaps on, how to correct any misconceptions that come into the classroom or in conversations that you encounter?
I think it's kind of a difficult thing I mean, right, we're all kind of under fire for how much we can insert our own personal sort of value system, right? So I don't claim that it's any harder for me necessarily, but at least at a high school level, we're trying to present something that's somewhat balanced. So usually for me, it's more avoidance. It's more, I don't use games like that in my classroom because I'm not kind of interest in sort of picking those apart. Um, I don't know, right? What do you do with stuff like that where it's I mean it fits, doesn't it fit right into radicalization in YouTube videos? I'm sorry I don't have an answer, but what do you do with that if it's like deeply seated cultural beliefs that are not good?
Hmm.
I mean, I think sometimes we don't know what the beliefs are or how deeply seated they are. But one thing that I have always done, regardless of where I teach, is get the students in the archives
Mm,
because you can argue with me, but you can't argue with the people who were there. Like you can say this is my bias, but if you're reading what someone wrote at the time it was actually happening, if we're going to the Library of Congress, if we're looking at all of these things that were left as artifacts for the sole purpose of making sure that the history is robust, then I think that is an excellent starting point for getting students to at least build out their idea of what happened, right? Like you can enjoy this entertainment for what it is and hold that there is a much more complex history that we have to acknowledge and synthesize. And so I think, at least providing that counterbalance is important.
I don't necessarily have students so much coming in with bias or, really like wrong-headed ideas so much as a lack of historical knowledge
Hmm.
and a kind of faith, like a kind of faith that the world wasn't as bad as maybe it was, or that the world isn't, um, I've had, I mean, things where, I teach a lot of silent cinema and, you teach sort of D.W. Griffith Broken Blossoms and they can look at it and go like, this is pretty racist, but they don't know about the Chinese Exclusion Act, and so sort of to situate things and sort of do that. Or I've had students with, Casablanca refer to the bad guys, and I'm like, do you mean the Nazis? Like, oh, okay, and you have to sort of stop and backtrack and kind of fill in those. I think there's historical gaps or ideas about gender, and in some ways they think things with gender were much more rigid. It's the fantasy that no one ever had sex before 2025. And so, sort of giving them histories about women, giving them histories about gay life, giving them histories, in all the different arenas, and I think sort of showing them, aspects of a different world. And for me, using films kind of is a point of entry to that. I need them to understand the history to better understand the film, but the film kind of opens that up for them. And so, it's, as I say, it's less about encountering kind of dark misconceptions and just kind of weird innocence or dumbness.
Yeah, I might maybe like shift the question then to the more perhaps positive or hopeful. Do you have any examples of mass media, speculative fiction, period piece fantasy that has been most informative or most useful in, conveying historical information to students or the public, or recommendations for the public?
I really love Get Out. I'm obsessed with Get Out. It's taking everything I have not to write about Get Out, but I have like a 5-page single space lesson plan on Get Out. It's like, it's such a rich text. And I think one of the things that's most exciting about it is um, getting to learn about a Black creative's process. And so if we think about Get Out and the fact that it comes out, I think in, was it 2016, 2017? So it comes out, at a time of just ridiculous, racial uprising and everything was in shambles. And, Jordan Peele actually changed the end of that movie because at a time where, Black people were literally being murdered on camera by the state, the original ending was not hopeful. And so he changed it to make it not only more in line with speculative fiction, but to give people something, leave them with something that wouldn't allow for hopelessness. And I think that in itself is um, part of the long line of Black cultural production, right? You want to give people something to hope for, something to reach for, kind of create a bit of a roadmap to a better society. And so, aside from the movie just being, a masterpiece, I think having that real time discernment to say, we're in a time of deep racial strife, like, what is this helpful? I think is how he sort of framed it. Is this a helpful ending for people? And if not, what does a helpful ending look like? And so I think something like that is, not only really generative academically, but just for the spirit.
Yeah. Mhm.
I don't know if this is, the kind of answer you're looking for this question because but I think one thing that pops into my mind is that, texts about the past that have been helpful to me in teaching and films about the past that have been helpful to me in teaching have not always been helpful because I think they are accurate or because I think the ideas they're conveying are good. Sometimes quite the reverse is the sort of teachable the teachable function, right? I mean, I talk in my little sort of brief presentation, I talked about 300, which is again a movie I get a fair amount of mileage out of for various reasons. But, I've taught the basic sort of framework of Orientalism in the classroom before as a way of having students sort of, understand discourses about the Eastern other and the kind of figure of the Eastern other as it's played a part in kind of quote unquote Western self-conception. And I can drop in a 3 or 4 minute scene from 300, which is so dense with Orientalism that it's like the core of a dying star. It's just such an incredible, second by second density of sort of effeminizing stereotypes about, Middle Easterners and sort of gay panic and sort of, visual suggestion of a kind of dialectical relationship between these two sides that they get it right away, right? And so it's sort of like, is this, is this a movie that if you encountered in the wild, I say, excellent, you learned about the Battle of Thermopylae? No, absolutely not. But is it a movie that I can use in the classroom very handily as a kind of as an approach to these subjects? Yeah, kind of.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. It's often the opposite that makes the most impact. Since we have only a couple of minutes left, I want to move to an audience question, which relates to one that I have. But are there scholarly organizations or groups that police video games and films to ensure some kind of accuracy or promote inclusion? Thinking about the Indigenous people and West Africans in the colonization game Dr. McCall mentioned, and should they rely on historical consultants?
Um, which ones? Which historical consultants and what view
Yeah.
would they have that we would and I say that not to be too cheeky, but at the end of the day, that's a big question. I mean, personally, I'm quite left of center and wish there was universal basic income for everybody, and so I probably would want to have a historian who kind of went for those things too, but that's not necessarily everybody's cup of tea. I guess what I would say is, um, I, I I can't separate myself as an educator from it. For me, it's engage, 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 and critique, critique, critique. And that's the real value in it. So I guess what I would say, um, and I think Makiba said it too, with like talking about the archive. I wish I had had your answer, Makiba. That was better than mine, which was like, I don't know what you do. Right. But at the end of the day, right, if we can promote more discourse and more conversation about these things, then it's going to be better. We'll critique them. I think the problem with having historians be the consultants is it misrecognizes that history and on film and games is just a different medium of history, and you can't do everything that you can do in a monograph. So I guess I would say I would plea, that we talk and we investigate and we share with people and we learn to know where our evidence comes from. But I probably wouldn't go so far as say there needs to be some panel approving because it begs the question of whose historical views are we doing?
Yeah.
And what kind of authoritarianism does that open? I mean, there's a
Yeah.
Right.
fantasy of like, oh, a consultant that will help make sure it's historically accurate. But as we know, history is being taken away from all of our national parks right now. The real, history is being managed. And then, yeah, who says that historical consultants are less ideological than filmmakers, right? I mean, so, and I think consultant and censorship are not the same thing, but that there's definite ways that you can think about that. And I think, historical fictions at least are basically adaptations, right? They take up historical facts, they shape them according to the needs of genre to suit contemporary taste, to serve as a star vehicle, to modernize and update. They're never going to reproduce history, even if that were possible. And there's a big difference between a documentary aiming to depict reality more directly in a historical fiction. But even so, there's a lot of shaping that's going to go into it. And as you say, you just have to sort of be prepared to analyze it and talk about it and assess, and compare.
Mhm.
I also
Yeah.
think
Go.
there's something to be said for not necessarily preparing to pawn that work off on the expert. I think one of the things that I found so um not surprising, but impressive about Sinners is that it's the story of many different cultures. And Ryan Coogler did a lot of that initial research himself and then outsourced what he did not know to people who would know, right? But I think it's important to at least, and this is, I'm sure something that we all try to impress upon our students, you have to be curious yourself and you have to do some of that work yourself. And I think we oftentimes sort of set up, creativity and like something like history as a binary, right? Like, you can't be creative and know the history, or, historians are not creative. And I think that's categorically false. But also, if you are dealing with historical fiction in any way, why would you not start that research yourself? Like I think that opens up more paths to anti-intellectualism that would not be helpful, particularly right now.
Yeah, I think everybody's made very important points. I also just want to briefly add, as a practical matter, that I think you could list lots of films which did have lavishly paid historical consultants, and their names appear prominently in promotional materials about the film, and it has no bearing on the final product whatsoever. And I also want to note in that connection that if Hollywood would like me to serve as that person, I would be very happy to do so. I will absolutely take Hollywood's money to be the name in the credits that didn't do anything. But in practice, that's been largely the history of that position. I mean, you don't, you get the sort of, oh, we talked to Mary Beard thing, and then it doesn't have a lot of, it doesn't reflect very much about the actual content in the end.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for those answers. I want to be respectful of people's time. We're almost at 7:15. I thank you so much for your presentations and your answers and comments on these topics. And so I just wanted to say thank you again to the Albert Lepage Center and to the College of Liberal Arts and Sciences at Villanova for your support in putting on this event. And thank you so much for your participation. Those who tuned in to listen to this conversation. Thank you so much. Stay warm, probably wherever you are listening from at this point. So thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.